Elizabeth Chau was born in November of 1979 to Vietnamese parents living in London, England, and all of her life she strived to do right by them and others. By the time she'd turned 15, family and friends described her as someone who was responsible and considerate, and by then Elizabeth had also figured out what she wanted to do with her future. Elizabeth had gotten into Thames Valley University in Ealing and was studying law and business, something that was sure to set her up to have a successful career for the rest of her life. But there were other reasons why Thames Valley University was a good fit for Elizabeth. She'd grown up in Ealing and her family still lived there, which meant that Elizabeth could focus on her education and have the university experience without needing to move out on her own, and therefore have so many more expenses that she would have to take care of. Elizabeth enjoyed her studies, but she also found time to be social as well. On Friday, April the 16th, 1999, Elizabeth set out from home to head into school. She only needed to hand in an assignment, but she stopped by the student union and had a drink with a friend as well. A good start to the weekend was ahead of them all. It was Friday, and with her assignment handed in, there would have been little stopping Elizabeth from turning one drink into two. However, Elizabeth was responsible. By 5 p.m, she was on her way home, and she ran into another friend at Ealing Broadway around 5:30. Just an hour later, she was caught by CCTV around Ealing Police Station, an incredibly short distance away from her front door. But somehow, Elizabeth didn't make it home that night. The footage showed Elizabeth wearing a dark purple V-neck jumper, a black body warmer, jeans and brown boots, but this turned out to be the very last image her family and friends and authorities had of her. In only the few metres that was left of her journey home, Elizabeth disappeared without a trace. Elizabeth was known to have been incredibly responsible, and when she failed to show up for dinner that night at home, her family immediately knew that something was wrong. They contacted the police, who were able to track Elizabeth's movements up until that final image of her right outside their door, and then nothing. She left behind all of her belongings, including her passport and all of her clothes, and her bank account hasn't been touched since, leaving her family and the investigators fearing the worst. In 2012, when there still weren't any answers, her family spoke to the press about Elizabeth and what the terrible weight of losing her has been like for all of them. Min Chau, Elizabeth's mother, said it was baffling that no one had seen what had happened to Elizabeth or where she had gone after she had passed the police station. She said, "She was a very considerate and caring young lady. An angel, really. She didn't go out that much and was dedicated to her studies." But with no witnesses and no answers, Elizabeth's trail went cold until another startling event only a year later. Elizabeth had been at the start of her adult life when she disappeared, but Lola Shenkoya had been putting her best foot forward for a good few years. At the age of 27, she was making sure that her degree in computer studies was going to good use at her job at Entertainment UK in Perivale, when a now all too familiar scene would play out. On Monday, January the 3rd, 2000, Lola left her workplace somewhere between 4 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. She was heading home to Swincombe Avenue, somewhere that should have put her firmly away from Elizabeth and those few metres that had turned the Chau family lives upside down. But there was a catch to that plan. Lola lived with her sister, and she had the only key to the door. As luck would have it, Lola's sister was out of the house when Lola made it home that day, and instead of waiting around for her to come back, Lola decided to do something with her evening. Witnesses saw her at a bus stop in Northfield Avenue, where she reportedly got on the E2 bus, getting off again at Haven Green, where the bus stopped right outside a Burger King, and that Burger King was right beside Ealing Broadway Underground Station. Once Lola was in Ealing, the similarity between her and Elizabeth's cases continued to grow. Witnesses saw Lola getting off the bus wearing a long black coat, a grey scarf and a velvet blue hat, and after that, she vanished. She left no word about where she was going or when she had planned on returning, leaving behind all of her clothes, her passport and her bank accounts have not been touched since. When they caught wind of Lola's disappearance, investigators were immediately reminded of Elizabeth's case, and though they had little physical evidence or witness accounts to go by, the investigators had an idea of what had happened to the pair of them. He was known as the Beast, a Polish immigrant who'd illegally entered the United Kingdom and managed to leave a lasting and horrible legacy behind him in only the few years that he was able to roam the streets of London freely. Andrzej Konowski had a dark past. He'd just gotten out of prison in Poland, where he'd served 10 years for over 27 charges of the rape and assault of multiple women and young girls, when he decided he was going to try and make it in the UK. He entered the country under false pretences, and it was only after the immigration office had caught up with him that the rest of the world caught a glimpse of the true nature of his crimes. While he was under arrest, DNA evidence linked him back to a crime that had previously left investigators more than a little chilled and horrified. Katarina Kaneva was only 12 years old when she came home from school one day in 1997. She was home alone, but her parents would have been home soon and they would have spent the evening together, just like they always did. Except this evening played out very differently. Someone was in the house waiting for Katarina, and he had only the worst of intentions. Once Katarina was inside, he blocked the door handle with a chair and pounced. He sexually assaulted Katarina before tying a telephone cord around her neck and began to strangle her. That sight was what Katarina's father walked in on only a few moments later, the chair behind the door stopping him from opening it up, but not stopping him from catching glimpses of what was happening through the gap between the door and floor. Her father, Traksha, began desperately fighting with the door, trying to break his way into the room, but the noise alerted the man inside and he jumped through an open window before he could get in. Not wanting the man to get away, Traksha traced him down the street until the man carjacked a car from a nearby woman and fled the scene. He rushed back to his daughter and managed to cut the cord from around her neck, but by the time the police and paramedics arrived at the scene, the worst had already happened. Investigators managed to recover fingerprints and hair samples belonging to the man who had raped and then murdered Katarina, but for a few years that was all they had, until Andrzej was arrested by immigration. Then that DNA evidence firmly put him at the scene, but it also opened a whole new can of worms. Andrzej was suspected for many assaults and murders, including that of another 12-year-old girl, but that was only the tip of the iceberg. After making contact with the authorities in Poland, the true extent of Andrzej's crimes came out, and so did his true nature. Andrzej was only 17 years old when he'd first been brought before the courts, and his first charges had been for a rape. The judge believed that Andrzej was highly unlikely to repeat his offences and sentenced him to only 3 years for his crimes. After his release, he found work as an ambulance driver in and around the city of Warsaw, and with that, his reign of terror truly began. While out in his ambulance, Andrzej would reportedly spot young women and girls out picking fruit and vegetables along the side of the road, and he would stop the vehicle. He would then drag these women and girls out into nearby fields or behind bushes where he would assault them. One time, he was even rumoured to have asked a woman for directions and pretended not to hear her, asking her to come closer and lean inside his car. He then used the car window to trap the woman's head and attacked her while she couldn't move. By the time Andrzej was in custody again in 1980, the prosecution practically begged for the court to sentence him to the maximum 25 years that was available for his charges, saying that they believed that Andrzej would only get worse once he was released, but the judge disagreed. Andrzej was sentenced to 15 years and was paroled in 1991 for good behaviour. If the judge had listened, the fates of at least 3 more teenage girls wouldn't have been sealed, but they did at least lead to Andrzej's arrest again in 1995. By then, Andrzej must have felt the noose tightening. He sold his flat in Poland, and when he was released to have a medical procedure done in the middle of his latest sentence, he used the money to buy a fake passport and fled to England. There, we know what he did, at least to some extent, but we know that he continued his long history of assaults and murders, picking up victims from around the Ealing area until he was finally arrested again in 2004. This time, the British courts were not about to make the same mistakes that the Polish ones had, and Andrzej Konowski was sentenced to a life in prison without the possibility of parole. And this meant that he would undoubtedly spend the rest of his life behind bars, but for a lot of people, his sentence was still disheartening. Andrzej only served 5 years of his sentence and died of natural causes behind bars, but only after 5 years, something that must have left the parents of his victims both relieved and angry. But it also left so many people without answers. The investigators had no physical evidence to tie him to them, but he was suspected of so many more crimes, including being the one to kidnap both Elizabeth and Lola. With him being gone so long and no movement on their bank accounts, the police and their families feared that they would never get their answers. They wanted to get to the bottom of these cases, but their main suspect was now gone. In 2012, the investigation into their disappearances were reopened, and a £15,000 reward was announced for anyone who had information that would lead to either one of their discoveries. The hope was that someone who'd been in contact with Andrzej over the years, particularly his cellmates, would have heard something that could crack the cases once and for all. But unfortunately, there has been nothing but radio silence. While there's been no new developments on cases like this for so long, it can be easy to forget what the families had gone through, or to just assume that they've moved on and managed to make the best of what's left of their lives. But it's difficult to do that without closure. Elizabeth's family have continued to speak out in the hopes that someone will come forward with something, either reuniting them with their lost daughter, or at least letting them know what happened to her. In a press release, they explain that they can't, and there is no moving on for them without knowing what happened to Elizabeth. Her brother said, "We have no closure and live with the pain every day. My parents are particularly distraught. They have not changed their phone number or moved house in the hope that she may one day return."